So why don't we go ahead and get started? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. JP Sanchez. I serve as the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Health Sciences Center here at the University of New Mexico. I want to thank everyone for joining us during this afternoon session as we have two distinguished speakers helping us talk about Disability Awareness Month. I'm just going to briefly mention each of the speakers and their bio, which is also on our HSC Celebrations website. So for today's session on perspectives from learners, faculty, and staff with disabilities, we have Audrey Eakman. And Audrey is one of our own medical students. So we're so excited to have Audrey here with us. Audrey is a deaf first-year MD student at our medical school at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. She is a member of the School of Medicine's Rural and Urban Underserved program. She graduated summa cum laude from UNM in 2022 with a BS, Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry. As a member of the UNM Combined BA MD program, she's also specialized in medical sociology and health communications. She's participated in research on the effects of the COVID pandemic on rural communities in New Mexico. She was diagnosed with progressive bilateral sensorineural hearing loss at age 7 and uses hearing aids, lip reading, and American Sign Language to aid her communication. She is a proud member of and advocates for the disabled community, especially in medicine. Thank you so much, Audrey, for being here with us. We also have...
Nice saying my pleasure.
Great. We also have Zainab Danani. Zainab is also a medical student and Master's of Science Health Policy student at Stanford School of Medicine. So we have the Southwest and the West Coast represented today. She is the founder of the annual Stanford Conference on Disability in Healthcare and Medicine and a previous BINGAP Academic Medicine Writing Fellow. Zainab is also the founder and executive director of the National Student-Led Disability Advocacy Organization, Medical Students with Disability and Chronic Illness, MSDCI. She has a keen interest in the equitable design of health systems, as well as wellness and belonging amongst healthcare professionals and trainees. Her research focuses on the impact of disability in medical education and health experiences, the use of digital and telehealth interventions in improving access to care for vulnerable populations, and health equity in radiology screening and imaging practices. She's thrilled to be able to share some of her work on disability advocacy with you all today. So thank you again, Zainab and Audrey, for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
So this is really a great opportunity for Zainab and Audrey to share their journey, their experiences, their reflections and thoughts on advocacy. As we go through today, we want it to be interactive, so I encourage everyone on this call to note questions in the chat box, and we'll also ask you also to unmute yourself in a little bit. But I'm going to ask for Audrey to start us off, and then Zainab also to answer the same question. But Audrey, if you could start us off and just share a little bit about your journey in your pursuit of a career in medicine.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to go in medicine mostly because of my experiences being disabled and chronically ill, especially since, most of my interaction with the medical community started when I was a child. And so I went to hospital a lot. I had a quite rare diagnosis, so I saw a lot of specialists. And I just had simultaneously a lot of respect for medicine as a practice, but also I had a lot of issues with my experiences in medicine, like times when I didn't feel like I was being respected. And so that's part of why I really wanted to go into medicine, was because I thought that my perspective of having disability and being chronically ill could help my patients basically, and help other people who are going through what I went through, have someone who is compassionate and understanding as the provider, which were things that I didn't always get to experience. When I knew I wanted to go into medicine, I was very fortunate. One of my pediatrician actually recommended I apply for the BA/MD program here at UNM, which is a fantastic program, and I was very, very grateful to get in. So that also really helped me, continue my journey through going into medical school. I got a lot of opportunities in undergrad that a lot of other people don't get. One of the other things that I've gone through on my journey was realizing that I wanted to become more visibly disabled. When I was in high school, I didn't necessarily want people to know that I had a disability, and I would kind of keep it, I would keep it more on the background. I didn't want it to define me, but the more I went forward, the more I realized that I actually, it was a benefit to the people around me if they realized that I had a disability. Because then they had to actually account for that and change their thinking. And I felt like through the act of asking for accommodations and accessibility, it improved the environment around me for everyone else. And so I started being an advocate, but first out of necessity, but then because I actually started to really enjoy the progress that I was seeing as I went through my academic career and the things that I was able to do just by speaking from my lived experiences. So that's kind of what led me to where I am right now.
Excellent. Thank you. Zainab?
Okay, so that is a hard act to follow. That's a really incredible story, Audrey. So for me, I was had my first really significant experience with chronic illness when I was 17. I was a senior in high school. And I really experienced some pretty significant discrimination right off the bat from my institution. And while at that point, I think I was in a position where, kind of similar to what Audrey mentioned, I didn't really want people to see me as disabled. I didn't really want that aspect of my identity to be publicly known. And I went into kind of college with the same mindset. And my interest in healthcare was more around my interest in the science of healthcare at that point. And then the further I got into college and experiencing kind of perpetual barriers, even in the college space around accommodations, in my healthcare experiences around kind of continuity of care between home and college, I kept finding more and more areas of kind of patient access that were bothering me and that kept drawing me in. And then I actually came to medical school, not planning on disclosing my disability and my chronic illness to my community. And then when I came here, Stanford happened to have an organization called Medical Students with Disability and Chronic Illness. And for me, it was like a switch turned on in my mind where it just normalized this idea of having a chronic illness or having a disability and being in this space and not treating it as a weakness or as, some sort of dirty secret, which is kind of I think the mentality that I'd developed from my experiences in high school and in college. And that's really what kickstarted my interest in really focusing on disability advocacy. It made such a huge impact on my experience as a medical student, not having to hide this very essential part of who I am and my life experiences. And I saw how much those conversations I was then able to have with classmates who don't have disabilities or chronic illnesses, how much that changed their perspectives and kind of their realms of understanding. And that's really what inspired my advocacy work. And then the further you get into it, the more you find so much meaning in it.
Thank you, both of you. And just to start off in encouraging everyone on this call to put forth questions, one of the things that I think I heard from both of you was to be more visible at different points of your educational journey. Can you once again mention what were the factors that you considered or that prompted you to be more visible? Like how, not everyone may want to be visible, but what were those factors that really influenced you, and what factors made it easier for you to be visible in an educational setting? And Audrey, if you want to start us with that.
Yeah, I can start. So one of the things that made me more visible was that starting medical school, I elected to start using full-time American Sign Language interpreting as an aid to me. I did not use that accommodation in undergrad. I relied on captions and rewatching videos and note-taking programs and stuff like that. So, but I didn't feel like I could have that kind of that distance in time between when I was given the information and when I actually understood the information, which I went in undergrad. So I started using ASL interpreting, which has been a very difficult and very wonderful experience because I have my interpreter with me basically everywhere I go, and she's signing. So there's no way that I can walk into a room and you wouldn't know that I'm deaf. And one of the benefits of that is that my peers around me have started to realize the utility of sign language. And a lot of my group members have been learning ASL so they can communicate with me, and also because they can communicate with patients who have, who will have hearing disability, or even if we want to just talk to each other without actually saying anything, like you're good, and like, oh, I'm fine, those kinds of really easy interactions have made my experience a little bit more richer. I feel like in general, whenever I ask for accommodations, for the most part, professors realize, providing captioning or posting lecture videos, whatever I ask for, it actually helps all the students, because even if they don't have a legal necessity to do it for them, it's still one extra thing that can make, the academic experience a little bit easier. So that's another real benefit that I've had with being visible, is I realized that I wasn't just helping myself by asking for accommodations or being visibly disabled, but that everybody else around me would also benefit from those accommodations once they became standardized, because it made the entire system more accessible for everyone, even if they didn't need that accommodation from a disability standpoint. What, you can talk a long time about the social construct of disability, but basically it just means that not everybody's going to work the same way. And so having that variety and that diversity that I provided helped everybody else as well.
Thank you.
So for me, I think it was a combination of factors. Like I said, for me, I really didn't kind of openly acknowledge myself as part of the disability or chronic illness community until I was in medical school. And I think in part it was because there was already a community, and I think there was some kind of normalization that comes with that for me. I think the other part was, for my chronic illness, I do by and large have the ability to kind of mask my status as someone with a disability. And I think I recognized that it really wasn't serving me to do so, and that I think it made it almost harder to be part of the community if I don't want to acknowledge myself. It's hard to be part of a community without acknowledging that you're part of a community. And I think I saw that, and I saw a lot of benefit. And then I think I came across faculty who were open about their disability here at Stanford. And I think to me, that showed me that you can do that, and you can be in the medical space and acknowledge that you are both somebody with a disability and somebody who is providing care for patients and great at what you do. And I think I really saw so many areas within medical education, even within my first 6 months in medical school, where things weren't accessible. I think the privilege that I had as somebody who could hide behind this identity as non-disabled, like visibly non-disabled, right? Even though I am disabled, I think that that really made me feel like it mattered for me to use that position and use it to help kind of change that narrative at Stanford and show that like the disabled community isn't just who you see as disabled, it's also a lot of other students who may not be visibly disabled, but who are still not being accommodated because of the way medical education structure is not made for the disability community. It is made under the perception of being used by those who are fully able-bodied. And so I think that really, really kind of kickstarted my decision to be more visible. And I think when I committed myself to the disability advocacy work, I also knew if I wanted to make the impact that, and I wanted to kind of go forward making the impact that I was aiming for, it would be both, it would feel disingenuous to me, and then it would also be in some ways a hindrance to try to balance this line of presenting myself as non-disabled and kind of separating myself from part of my identity while doing this work that's so deeply rooted in personal experience.
Great, thank you. I think as many offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion in graduate schools invest in pathway programs to attract diverse talent and diversify our workforce, one of the things I heard from both of you examples of who called on you to consider pursuing medicine. Audrey, I heard you say a pediatrician was the first person. And so could both of you just mention a little bit more on who were the people that called you into medicine, a medical career, and why was that so meaningful? Like, was the pediatrician the first person? And what did they say? And what more can we do to call in people with disabilities into our pathway programs?
Yeah, so for me, I was interested in medicine before my pediatrician recommended I apply for the BA/MD program, but she was I would say a cheerleader for me in my medical journey. So she was my pediatrician, she was also a family friend, and so she was really a really fantastic resource when I realized that I wanted to go into medicine. I feel like in terms of like pathways, like how to get disabled people into medicine, most of them don't think that medicine and disability necessarily, that it's like lithium and water sometimes. Medicine has this stereotype as being very difficult, and it is stressful, and it is, but because of that, that kind of reputation is really disheartening for somebody who already struggles to do what is socially accepted of them in terms of ability. And so what you really need to realize that they can do it is I think seeing other people who are disabled in medicine, like you mentioned, is really helpful. I have, I believe, 2 professors right now with physical disabilities, and it just makes me feel very safe where I am. Like, they're not the same disabilities that I have, but they are disabilities. So just to see that that is a possibility. So those kinds of mentorship things where you see disabled people succeeding in medicine, that's what disabled people need to see to realize that they can go to the same place. Because and then just knowing that, you know, the program is going to be accessible for them, because nobody wants to, like, that honestly, like, getting accessibility sometimes is harder than actually doing your homework. So making sure that that is not a barrier to them is going to be another large thing, I believe.
Thank you.
I am going to echo a lot of what Audrey said. I think for me, my interest in medicine was kind of, I would say, separate from my experience as a person with a disability. I do think ultimately my experiences as a person with a disability kind of shifted some of my focus to be more interested in some of these healthcare experience aspects of medicine, and kind of understanding how we can better patient experiences, and also kind of belonging in the physician workforce. But I think as far as pathways, I think there's a couple ways that, several ways actually, medical education can kind of take steps forward. I think visibility of individuals with disabilities always, in medicine, helps. I think people with disabilities often don't really see a space for themselves in medicine. They may not have come across providers with disabilities. They may read a program's technical standards and feel like this doesn't align with what I like with my disability. There's very little literature on accommodations that are available for medical students with disabilities, or trainees with disabilities, or kind of how those accommodations work. There's so many unique clinical skills in medicine, and kind of being able to have support in figuring out how those can be accommodated, and kind of a friendly, friendly introduction to accommodations, rather than it being kind of this solo search and endeavor of convincing institutions to acknowledge your accommodations, or to be willing to try out different accommodations to see what's able to work for you and your needs. I think all of those tend to be really big barriers. And I think one of the biggest kind of leaks in that pipeline tends to be in that interim between pre-medical to medical student. I think there's a lot of pre-medical students that are interested and then don't really find a space for themselves in medicine, or are discouraged by pre-medical advisors because of their disability or chronic illness, are discouraged during interviews, or experience discriminatory questions during interviews. That's something I can say I've experienced myself as well, being questioned about about there being a space for me in medicine as somebody with a chronic illness. I think all of those are really big points. And I think from an institutional standpoint, really visible, inclusive practices, and in recruitment, in website statements, in interview days, all of those signal to pre-medical students with disabilities or chronic illnesses that this institution values you and is not just accommodating you because they are required to, and are not just, tolerating your disability as an aspect of their diversity, but you're actually cherished and valued, and your perspectives are something that institution wants as part of their community. And I think that makes a really big difference, because medical school is difficult. It is challenging. And then to have to kind of push against an institution that's structures kind of tell you that there's not space for you here, and kind of constantly having to push for that space, I think tends to be just another very weighty source of burnout for individuals with disabilities in a space that already, chronically experiences burnout, and becomes really difficult. So I think that those would kind of be my biggest points of advice, is make it so students and faculty and residents, everybody sees that disability is a proud and valued aspect of diversity at your institution. And I think this is what you guys are doing here, right? With this series for Disability Heritage Month, acknowledging it and valuing it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So you've sort of touched upon this, but want to just take a moment to do a little bit of a deeper dive. We want to make sure that we're not only helping learners survive, but more importantly, thrive. When you reflect on your educational journey as successful pre-medical students, successful graduate students, and now successful medical students, what do we need to continue to do? And what do we need to advance to ensure an equitable environment, educational environment for you and peers who identify with disabilities? So what do we need to do to ensure an equitable educational environment for you and your peers?
One of the first things that comes to my mind is that we shouldn't really need to ask so much for accommodations. I understand that that's kind of like the way the process is built, is you have to request these things, but the process of requesting them can sometimes take a very long time before you actually see results. I believe I was just advised by my accommodation specialist here at UNM School of Medicine, it's actually here at High Tech. She advised me that for the step 1, I have to start asking for accommodations a year in advance. And I know that's not necessarily this institution, so much it is the medical, the A as a whole, but it is, an aspect that is consistent, is that these institutions are not designed with the thought that people will ask for accommodations. And so when someone finally does ask for accommodations, it becomes an entire process with paperwork and red tape and lots of meetings, because the system was not built such that it assumes that these things would be necessary. And so I think if we want to advance it, you have to kind of just make those tweaks, you can't only use them when you have a disabled person in the classroom, or you have to make sure that, because not everybody, again, with the non-disabled or the people who have a disability but aren't disclosing it, they're not always going to ask, but they're still going to need it. And so you have to design an institution that can, I don't want to say lowest common denominator, but it can support everybody. It can, even if you don't want to say that you need captions, there's still captions on the lecture videos, even though you don't say you want to have, time extensions, maybe the time limits on the test. And I know this is, again, difficult because the medical system is structured in such a way and has been structured in such a way for such a long time that we don't allow those things. It seems like, doctors should be able to do this in X amount of time, or you should be able to answer all of these multiple choice questions in X amount of time. But I don't think that those barriers necessarily are they're not real, they're just constructed. We've just decided for so long that that's what people are supposed to be able to do. And again, I keep mentioning this whole social construct of disability. Whether or not you are disabled comes down to what is being expected of you. And so to have much more flexible expectations will help all students, not just the ones with, disabilities. And it will also just make your entire system be more fair and more equitable as a whole.
Thank you, Audrey.
I am going to echo that. I think, we've found time and again that oftentimes accommodations that are made for people with disabilities then end up benefiting far more than just the disabled community. And I think from a medical education standpoint, there's a system called the Universal Design for Learning. That's a framework that's based on research supported for creating learning spaces that are flexible and accommodate differences in individual learning. And I think that as a baseline can really be applied to medical education to increase accessibility. And then, like Audrey said, make it so that things that are now currently requested as accommodations are instead built into the system. I think on a faculty level, when everybody started doing virtual working from home and things like that during the pandemic, we saw a lot of people who identified as part of the disability community who had been fighting for such options and receiving so much resistance, then see that systems can change, they can adapt if they are incentivized to do so. And oftentimes that internal incentive and internal willingness to make those changes is what we really find as the biggest barrier in medical systems. Oftentimes there's a lot of bureaucracy in kind of getting buy-in for these changes that ultimately end up benefiting far more than just the disability community. And I think there's a lot to be done in that kind of space. I think in terms of things to keep, I think it's really helpful when there's a disability service provider specific to medical institutions, because I think there's a lot of nuance in medical education that doesn't apply to outside institutions. And so that is always something that I always push for. I think having visibility, again, is just one of the biggest things, because I think just knowing you belong makes a really big difference. I think having systems where students aren't forced to kind of discuss or negotiate their disabilities with their evaluators is a really important point. It puts students in an uncomfortable position. It leaves students susceptible to acquiescing to give up certain accommodations, despite their right to those accommodations, because they at the end of the day also know that they are in a position of inferiority in terms of the power structure there. I think all of those things make a really big difference. And I think a lot of it is just compassion, just rethinking and kind of building compassion into the medical education infrastructure that currently has some unnecessary rigidity that makes things difficult for both students with the individuals with disabilities, but also just for general medical population. I think those are kind of some of my most learned lessons thus far.
Great. Thank you, Zainab. I know that one of our participants today, Kelly Cano Martinez, had commented on that last question and also universal design. I don't know, Kelly, would you like to mention anything else or any follow-up questions?
I don't know if I have much to comment other than it's great to hear Audrey and Zainab say, talk about their experience. And I think just overall universal design is something that's systemic, and it kind of starts at this top and then trickles down. And so if we talk more about universal design and start that conversation and maybe try to put some change starting at the top, it's going to trickle down and ultimately help everybody in the system. And of course, that's a lot easier said than done, but talking about it, putting the work into it is going to be the most important, and not being quiet about it is going to be important as well. I don't necessarily have any questions. It's great to see you, Audrey, and great to meet you, Zainab, and great to meet you and see your face, Dr. Sanchez. I don't think we've just emailed, but not yet seen each other's faces. So great to see you too. Other than that, that's about it.
Great. Thank you. So I think the third question that I had, and once again, just want to turn it over to everyone on this call, is both of you, I believe, mentioned that you consider yourselves advocates and leaders. And I value and thank you for playing both of those roles. Can you share a little bit more of what it means to be an advocate and a leader, and how you're doing that work, right? If you could share a little bit more detail about that, what it means to you, and how do you hope to continue to succeed as an advocate and leader? And maybe Audrey, you could start us.
Yeah, so I have for this, I think there are like a couple of different ways to be an advocate. I think at an institutional level, I have to kind of be like the rock at the bottom of the shoe to kind of just remind them that, hey, I exist, and this is these are problems, these are things that are present. Because I feel like, again, like these institutions have been so rigid and so structured for so long that it's not necessarily out of like cruelty or anything like that. It's just they don't know how to function in a different way than they've been functioning. So you kind of have to be a little bit annoying at every step of the way to point out when things are inaccessible. And I don't even just think about accessibility from the standpoint of what my abilities and disabilities are. I kind of also think about, if I had other, where is something inaccessible, even from a perspective that is not my own. You become more aware of that as you go through, because I feel like the disabled perspective offers a lot of innovation, because we have to find a way to exist and live our lives outside of what is socially accepted or expected of us. And so also part of being an advocate is just speaking to that innovation and saying, oh, well, I have an idea. And, I feel like people are very receptive to that. I have not had very many like incredibly negative experiences. Most of the, I would say, negative experience I have had mostly came out of a place of ignorance or miscommunication, more so than people actually not wanting to accommodate me or not like seeing the validity of my perspective. It's just, especially in medicine, disability does not fit within the constructed model of what medicine means. I mean, just like from a medical standpoint, the fact that you're not going to be able to cure everybody and that some people are not going to be the optimal human, it kind of gets in the way of a lot of the traditional biomedical thinking that, this is what normal is supposed to be, and we need to fix any deviation outside of that. And so being able to provide that alternate version of what normal can look like, I think really benefits medicine, and it expands its horizons on, maybe your priority shouldn't be like curing all of these diseases so much as making sure that a patient feels listened to and respected, and that their life is one that is enjoyable and that they're a happy person. And that maybe matters more than, erasing all of those symptoms or that kind of thing. So I think that is my advocacy in medicine is both like at an institutional level, reminding them of where they can improve, and then on more of a medical level, reminding them that there's more than one way to be a human being.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey.
I think for me, my advocacy has been quite a journey. I think it began with being part of the medical students with disability and chronic illness community at Stanford. And we really normalized the conversation with just really simple Ask Me Anything events where students with disabilities just invited the rest of the student community to come for lunch and ask questions around our experiences as individuals with disabilities, ask questions about kind of why we are so passionate about disability advocacy, about the barriers that we face, the things that we think in medical education that, are ableist or challenging and like unaccommodating for individuals with disabilities. And just really letting them see a more human side of it, because I think people oftentimes a very medical, like Audrey said, a very medical perspective of disability is often taught. And so allowing our fellow classmates to really connect with the human side of disability. And from there, there was so much momentum in that community and in seeing the work that I think for me, it was, we're having this conversation here at Stanford, and that's wonderful, but what about everywhere else? And with an incredible mentor, Dr. Peter Poulos at Stanford, we co-organized the Stanford Conference on Disability in Medicine and Healthcare. And that was, with credit to COVID, converted from an in-person to a virtual event, which really actually helped expand our reach, and really showed and like reaffirmed for me that there is a national interest in this topic, that there are so many members of the disability community that are in healthcare, whether as providers, as administrators, as educators, in all different roles that are invested in this, but haven't found that conversation and community and really been able to build that traction moving forward. And from that, I also found a lot of medical students at institutions where there aren't, particularly supportive infrastructures, or there aren't disability student groups. And that is what ended up pushing me to create MSDCI National, which is essentially a national advocacy organization for medical students who identify as part of the disability or chronic illness community, and allies. And we have been around for about 3 years now, and have grown to have what is now roughly 21 chapters at medical schools across the country. And our hope is to kind of develop these chapters, like affinity groups or identity groups for disability at medical schools in order to normalize the idea that disability is part of diversity. It is a normal and welcomed aspect of diversity at medical institutions, and it kind of sets this underlying tone of belonging and acknowledgement that disability has a space here at this institution. And then from that, really working to educate the medical community on, the value of disability in the provider workforce, and the fact that patients with disabilities experience disparities at unimaginable rates, and those rates have not been improved over the past 20 years and counting. And so clearly there's a lot of work to be done around care for patients with disabilities. And, there's more than enough studies that likely everybody in this room is already familiar with that show that representation plays an important role in combating health disparities. And so our work has kind of expanded in that front to do education work, to do advocacy. Particularly, there's not currently really accreditation requirements around providing disability-focused medical education and training. And so every year, a new class of physicians graduates without receiving, comprehensive training in working with patients with disabilities. And then we question, again, why there are disparities, why healthcare experiences for individuals with disabilities tend to be far more negative compared to those without disabilities. And so really wanting to tackle the problem from the system level and let that benefit trickle down across in all institutions. Because while I love the work that I get to do within the Stanford community, I also recognize we are just one very small class of medical students in a much larger system. And the reality is these changes do need to happen at a very broad level. And with that, we've also most recently kind of launched into disability-focused research because, again, another area that is underdeveloped and under-resourced, and particularly for medical students who are part of the disability community or allies who are interested in and committed to helping advance healthcare for patients with disabilities or advance opportunities for individuals with disabilities in medicine. Oftentimes, the medical community is most motivated by data-driven recommendations, but also there has to be an opportunity and mentorship to cultivate that data. And so we've been able to find individuals who have had experiences and mentors across different institutions who are willing to help guide students who haven't had experiences with disability-focused research and create. We now have 6 concurrent projects going with over 24 medical students involved. And this brings up what we're hoping is that'll bring up a whole new generation of physicians and practitioners who are also well-versed in conducting research within the disability space and then able to amplify that work at their own institutions wherever they go for medical school, residency, career-wise, et cetera. So that is kind of the way our work has developed. And I think what I've learned really has been that you have to invite yourself to the table and like make the space for yourself that you want. A lot of times when you're getting started, and then don't be afraid to really dream big. I think it's terrifying in the sense that, as is often the times with diversity communities working against a system that's not necessarily built for them, it kind of feels like a David and Goliath situation. But you very quickly find that there are more people who are willing to be in your corner, and the more you're willing to kind of work with other communities who are experiencing disparities, the larger you're able to build a coalition that has power far greater than any individual effort. And we've really benefited from that, from seeing the benefit of having multiple chapters and having, individuals at so many institutions that are working as a collective. working with other disability focused institutions, other institutions who are not necessarily disability focused, but focused on other aspects of diversity. And that is, I think all of that really plays a really big role in the success that we've had as an organization as well. But yeah, so that's a little bit about kind of my advocacy journey.
Excellent, excellent, really outstanding. And so the things that have that really remain in my mind based on what the both of you have shared is that rock in the shoe, Audrey, and also how we've struggled with moving beyond a treatment-based culture and identity to move even beyond prevention and what you're mentioning, quality care, right? What does it mean to have quality healthcare and have a quality life beyond treatment or prevention? And then saying the sort of comprehensive approach in education, research, so service, advocacy with the work complemented by scholarship. So thank you both for those great thoughts and shared experiences. So I just want to afford a couple of minutes to our colleagues who have joined us today and just invite them to pose any questions, comments, thoughts, their own personal perspectives. But we would love to hear from anyone else who's joining us today.
I have a question. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma, pronouns she, her. I'm the Assistant Director of Learning Environment Office. I think most of you know me, Zainab. It's great to meet you and hear from you. Apologies for my camera being off today. I wanted to, so as many of you know, but Zainab, I'll share with you quickly, our Learning Environment Office is tasked with reducing, addressing, and preventing the mistreatment of learners here at our School of Medicine. And one thing that our data have been showing us lately is that medical students who identify as disabled are being mistreated at higher rates than their peers who don't identify that way. And we didn't ask, so we don't have a breakdown on whether we're talking about folks with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, chronic illness. We don't have that breakdown, but I've really appreciated hearing what both of you have shared about hoping to change the way that we are educating current students and future students to become better practitioners. But I was wondering, as we are looking at trying to address and prevent mistreatment of medical students with disabilities, particularly in the clinical environment, in phase 2 and phase 3, other than, telling providers, please be better, and waiting until sort of a next generation comes through and becomes the providers, as we are looking to really seriously tackle this work, if you have any advice or ideas for us of things that you think we could be doing as an office here at the School of Medicine to help make sure that folks are not having these sort of disproportionate mistreatment experiences. So I just really want to pick your brains because we're doing what we can, but we want to be doing a lot more.
So if I can start, if that's okay, one of the big things that comes to mind for me is education, which I know is again difficult to do in these kinds of settings when we're dealing with attendings and faculty who probably have a solidified mindset on what medicine should look like and what disability is. But I do think that, for the most part, most of the times that I have experienced situations where I didn't necessarily feel comfortable were because they didn't realize that people with disabilities could do what we do. They didn't understand that there's other ways to practice medicine. And so I think, again, just having that be visible and saying, these are alternate ways that we can have a clinical situation go, or these are alternate ways that we can have a meeting. It's something that my one of my interpreting specialists said, is that in medicine, you kind of have a hierarchy, a pyramid. And so the people who are at the top have more control over the situation than the people at the bottom. And so the people at the bottom have to do way more work to be equally heard and to be equally, that have control of the situation. She works with providers who have disabilities, and she says that they have less difficulty than medical students with disabilities, because when you're an attending, you can control the clinical situation. You can say, nurse, go listen to this guy's heart for me. You can, so there's a little bit of privilege within the medical power system, and I think that it makes medical students disproportionately impacted by a lack of accommodations or lack of accessibility, or that kind of mindset, because they don't have the benefit of power within the clinical system when they are, facing situations that might result in mistreatment or inaccessibility. So I don't know exactly what that implementation would be to find that solution, but I do believe that if you want to make a solution for those problems, you have to make sure that the people who control those clinical situations understand that maybe the system that they are used to or that they feel comfortable with isn't going to be helpful for everybody.
I'm going to echo that. I think there's a lot of systems barriers, but I will say the first step, I think, is something you guys are already doing. You're collecting the data, right? You're making sure that you acknowledge that, of the mistreatment reports that you guys receive, there is a disproportionate amount that belong to students with disabilities or chronic illnesses. And so it is acknowledging that this is an area where there may be additional bias. I think like Audrey said, the education front is really important. I think particularly when you're thinking about the clinical space and education, I think really tailored education of what it means to accommodate students. So understanding things that are as simple as having a student with a mobility limitation take the elevator and meet you downstairs while the rest of the team takes the stairs. That is not inclusive. Having them understand also just the very basic concept that accommodations mean that you may have a different experience, but that does not inherently make it a lesser experience. And understanding, because I think sometimes there's, particularly in, clinical education, this perception of, the more you completely burn yourself out in the effort of your rotation, the more dedicated you are to the field. And I think that's a misconception in medicine at large that needs to be corrected. But I think particularly when it comes to students with accommodations, then they experience kind of this additional barrier where, there's a conflation of their accommodations and a perception of lack of enthusiasm, where it's not a lack of enthusiasm. It's just that I need to be healthy enough to be here on rotations. And that requires abiding by certain accommodations that are not going to keep me from, completing my responsibilities while I'm here, but require you to kind of question your thinking as to how you measure student commitment and how you measure, effective work in the clinical workspace. And so that's, one of the big things that I recommend is really getting that tailored education for those involved in the clinical space. And then I think the reality is mistreatment requires a level of reprimand, right? And so I don't know what the structure is at UNM, but I think making sure that those who are engaged in mistreatment, assuming that the reports, name a specific individual, that those individuals are then made to understand the significance of those reports and the role that those reports have, not just in, an email or a conversation from somebody they don't know saying, you were reported as having mistreated a student XYZ, but having mistreatment coaches within the department, right? So it's a colleague that is now calling them in and saying, this happened. We don't want to see it happen again. It is concerning to us, and moving forward, and having it so that there is an accountability, that they know that this is something that their colleagues are recognizing, so they know it'll impact their career, as well as, of course, hopefully an innate, desire to not mistreat a student again. There's also kind of a personal accountability aspect to it that I think does play an important role, because I think a lot of times it's easier than to brush off these incidences as misremembered or misunderstood, when sometimes it may be a misunderstanding, but a lot of times it really is just mistreatment. And sometimes it's difficult to acknowledge that because everybody comes in with hopefully good intentions into the space of medicine, but recognizing that those biases still exist and we need to make space for really countering them.
Well, I want to thank everyone. We're at the hour. I want to be mindful that people may be running to their next meeting or their educational and clinical responsibilities. Can you please help me in giving a huge round of applause for Audrey and Zainab for their incredible work and really teaching us quite a bit. Keep up the outstanding work, and know that we're here to support you and watch you as you thrive at the institution. So once again, thank you so much, Audrey and Zainab.
Thank you all for having us.
So I'll stay behind just in case anyone wants to make any provide any additional thoughts or questions. Remember that tomorrow and Thursday, we have 2 additional fantastic sessions. Tomorrow, 12 to 1, and Thursday as well, 12 to 1. And all of the sessions will be posted on the HSC Celebration site for continued learning and development. Thank you again.